The buzzards told the first part of the story. They circled high in the merciless white-hot sky, a patient, spiraling punctuation mark over a sentence of death written in the dust. For a lone rider, a man who read the prairie like a book, those birds were a chapter heading he knew all too well. He wasn't a hero looking for a soul to save. He was just a man named Jake Sterling, minding the business of his own survival. But destiny, much like a dust storm, doesn't care about a man's plans. And as he crested the rise, he saw the story's subject, a body, not yet a corpse, clinging to life by a thread the desert was determined to snap. A sun-bleached ribcage of a long-dead steer pointed the way. Jake Sterling swung down from his buckskin mare, the leather of his saddle creaking like a tired man's bones. Dust, finer than flour, settled on the sweat stain darkening the back of his shirt. He approached the figure cautiously, his hand resting on the worn, walnut grip of his Colt Peacemaker. You didn't survive long in the Arizona Territory by assuming the best. The man was a mess of dried blood and cracked lips. His clothes, a fine wool jacket, and trousers now shredded and stained, spoke of money and a life far from this God-forsaken expanse. A city man by the look of his soft, uncalloused hands, though they were currently scraped raw. One leg was bent at an angle that made Jake's own bones ache in sympathy. The man's breath was a shallow, ragged whisper, a sound almost lost beneath the drone of flies. Jake knelt his spurs, chinking softly. He pressed 2 fingers against the man's throat, a pulse, faint and thready as a spider's web, but there. The man's eyes fluttered open, the blue in them, clouded with pain and confusion. Water. The stranger rasped the word, cracking in his throat. Jake didn't hesitate. He unhooked his canteen, uncapped it, and gently poured a few precious drops onto the man's lips. The stranger coughed, then drank with a desperate greed that spoke of days under the sun. Jake pulled the canteen back. Too much, too fast would kill him, sure as a bullet. Easy now, Jake said, his voice a low baritone roughened by solitude. Who did this to you? The man's eyes unfocused, rolling back. He mumbled something incoherent, a name perhaps lost in a delirium of pain. Jake scanned the area. A single set of hoof prints, shod with iron, not the unshod ponies of the natives, led away to the east. Alongside them the tracks of 2 other horses ridden hard. An ambush. Robbery likely, though. They'd left the man his expensive-looking boots. That was odd. Most trail robbers would take everything down to a man's socks. Leaving him here was a death sentence. The buzzards were already making their preliminary bids. Taking him was a fool's errand. The nearest town, Redemption Creek, was a good 2 days' ride, and Jake was traveling light. This man was dead weight, an anchor that could drag them both down into this dusty grave. Jake stood staring down at the broken man, the hard pragmatism of the frontier, warring with a stubborn ember of decency he thought he'd long since extinguished. He'd seen enough death in the war and in the years since to have grown a callous on his soul. He'd told himself he was done with other people's troubles. He was heading for the San Pedro River country to find a small piece of land and be left alone. But the stranger's shallow breathing was a persistent, nagging question. Could he just ride away? Could he live with the silence that would follow, knowing he'd left a man to be eaten by coyotes and picked clean by vultures? He cursed a short, sharp sound that was swallowed by the immense silence of the prairie. He'd seen the man's face. He'd given him water. The act had forged a bond, a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but now couldn't shake. The logistics were a nightmare. The man couldn't ride. Jake's mare, Daisy, was sturdy, but she couldn't carry 2 men for 50 miles over rough country, not with their limited water. He needed a travois. He scanned the sparse landscape, mesquite and scrub brush. Not ideal. He rode a quarter-mile to a dry arroyo where a few stunted cottonwoods clung to the memory of water. With his hatchet, he chopped 2 long, reasonably straight poles trimming the branches. He hacked through thickets of hardy greasewood for the cross members. It was grueling work under the oppressive sun. Sweat poured off him, stinging his eyes, and carving clean paths through the grime on his face. Returning to the stranger, he fashioned the rig. He used his bedroll and a spare blanket to create a sling between the poles, lashing everything together with the pigging string from his saddle and some extra lengths of rope he always carried. He hitched the front of the poles to his saddle horn, testing the balance. It was clumsy, but it would have to do. Getting the man onto the travois was the next ordeal. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight that groaned with every movement. Jake had to be as gentle as a blacksmith, shoeing a nervous filly, trying not to jostle the broken leg. The man cried out on a sharp, piercing sound of agony before passing out again. Better that way, Jake thought. He secured him as best he could, using the last of his rope. He took the man's gun belt, a fancy silver-buckled affair holding a Colt that looked like it had never been fired, and looped it over his own shoulder. He found no wallet, no identification. Just a man with no name and a world of trouble. Finally grim-faced and already weary, Jake mounted Daisy. He clicked his tongue, and the mare moved forward tentatively, at first unused to the strange drag behind her. The travois scraped and bounced over the hard-packed earth, and Jake winced with every jolt, imagining the pain it was causing his passenger. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The temperature dropped, but the air remained thick and heavy. The journey to Redemption Creek had begun. It was a slow, agonizing crawl across a landscape that didn't suffer fools or saints. Jake Sterling, who considered himself neither, wasn't sure which category he'd just volunteered for. He only knew the weight of the stranger behind him was more than physical. It was the weight of a choice, and he'd have to drag it and the man all the way to whatever end awaited them. The prairie stretched on vast and indifferent, and the buzzards, cheated of their meal, followed at a distance waiting. They knew the desert always got its due one way or another. The name of the town was a promise the place couldn't keep. Redemption Creek was less a creek and more a muddy trickle that dried up completely by midsummer, and redemption was in short supply everywhere. It was a handful of clapboard buildings huddled together against the vastness of the prairie, a way station for prospectors' cowboys and those who'd run out of other places to go. A single wide, dusty street served as its spine, flanked by a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, a livery stable, and, mercifully, an office with a faded shingle that read, Dr. Elias Finch, physician and surgeon. Jake looked like a ghost when he finally guided Daisy down that street. His face was a mask of dust and exhaustion, his eyes red-rimmed and sunken. Behind him, the travois had held, but the man in it was barely recognizable as human. He was pale as bleached bone, his fevered mumblings the only sign of life. Townsfolk stopped and stared. A woman carrying a basket of laundry froze mid-step. 2 old men playing checkers on a barrel outside the general store let their game lie forgotten. A lone cowboy leading a man on a travois was a grim spectacle, a common enough tragedy of the trail that it still commanded a somber respect. Jake pulled Daisy to a halt in front of the doctor's office. He didn't have the strength to dismount gracefully, instead sliding from the saddle and stumbling, catching himself on the hitching post. The door to the office opened before he could reach it. A man in his late 60s with a fringe of white hair around a bald head and spectacles perched on his nose emerged. He wore a stained apron over a white shirt. This was Dr. Finch. His eyes, magnified by the thick lenses, took in the scene with a practiced professional calm. "Bring him in," the doctor said, his voice surprisingly firm. Quickly, with the help of the blacksmith, a barrel-chested man named Gus, who had lumbered over from across the street, they managed to carry the stranger inside. They laid him on a narrow examination table in a room that smelled of carbolic acid and whiskey. Rosalie Miller heard the commotion from the boarding house. She ran next door. She came over with a bucket of fresh water, her brow furrowed with concern. She was a woman in her late 20s, with sensible brown hair, tied back, and hands that were rarely still. The frontier had weathered her, but it hadn't hardened her eyes. "What happened?" she asked, looking from the broken man on the table to Jake's exhausted face. "Found him in the Badlands." Ambushed, Jake grunted, leaning against the doorframe for support. Dr. Finch was already at work, cutting away the shredded trousers from the injured leg. He hissed through his teeth. "A compound fracture. Nasty one. The bone's broken the skin. Infection's already setting in, I'd wager." He turned to Jake. You look like you've been through a ringer yourself." "Rosalie, get this man some water and something to eat. Gus, I'll need you to help me hold him down. This is going to be unpleasant." For the next hour, Jake sat in a chair in the corner, nursing a tin cup of water Rosalie had given him. He was too tired to eat the bread and jerky she offered. He watched, detached, as Dr. Finch worked. The doctor, with Gus's help, forced a shot of laudanum and a slug of whiskey down the stranger's throat before setting the bone. The man's scream was muffled, but it echoed in the small room, a raw sound of pure agony that made Jake's teeth ache. Finch worked with a grim determination, cleaning the wound, setting the pieces of bone as best he could, and fashioning a splint from pieces of a wooden crate and clean bandages. Rosalie moved with quiet efficiency, fetching hot water, tearing strips of cloth, and wiping the sweat from the doctor's brow. They were a well-practiced team, accustomed to the brutal ballet of frontier medicine. When it was over, the stranger was unconscious, again his breathing shallow, but even. His leg was immobilized, and the fever still raged. "He'll live?" Jake asked, the words feeling heavy in his mouth. Dr. Finch wiped his hands on a rag, not meeting Jake's eyes. "Maybe. The leg is one thing. The fever is another. Infection in a break like this. It can take a man down faster than a bullet. He's lost a lot of blood. Been without water for days by the look of him. He's young, strong. That's in his favor. But the next 48 hours will tell the tale." Rosalie placed a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder. "You should get some rest. You've done all you can. More than most would have." Jake just nodded his body, finally admitting the depth of its exhaustion. He followed Rosalie next door to the boarding house. She showed him to a small, clean room with a bed that looked like heaven. He barely managed to pull off his boots and gun belt before he fell onto the mattress and was swallowed by a deep, dreamless sleep. He awoke hours later to the sound of hushed voices from the parlor below. The sun was setting. He sat up, his muscles screaming in protest. He felt a pang of hunger and realized he hadn't eaten a real meal in days. He washed his face in the basin, the cool water, a small miracle. As he came down the stairs, he saw Rosalie talking to Sheriff Brody. Brody was a man who had grown soft in his job. His belly strained the buttons of his vest, and his face was perpetually flushed. He was more concerned with keeping the peace in the saloon than chasing outlaws across the county. "Found him east of the cinder cones," Rosalie was saying. "The man who brought him in is upstairs resting." Sheriff Brody shifted his weight, his thumbs hooked in his belt. "Any idea who he is, or who did it?" "He hasn't been lucid enough to say a word," she replied. "But he's no drifter. His clothes are fine make. And the cowboy Jake said it looked like an ambush, not a simple robbery," Brody grunted. "Probably gamblers settling a score, Or maybe he crossed the wrong man over a woman. Happens all the time. I'll ask around, but don't expect much. A nameless man shot up in the desert ain't exactly top priority. He tipped his hat to Rosalie and sauntered out his duty as he saw it performed. Jake stepped into the room as the sheriff left. Rosalie turned a flicker of disappointment on her face. Doesn't sound like he'll be much help, Jake observed. Sheriff Brody prefers his troubles small and manageable, she said with a sigh. A dead man in the desert is just paperwork he'd rather avoid. How are you feeling better? Thank you. For this. He gestured around the comfortable room. You earned it, she said simply. Dr. Finch is with him now. His fever is high. A question had been nagging at the edge of Jake's mind. They took his money, I assume, but they left his boots, his gun too. Why, Rosalie frowned, considering it. You're right, that is strange. Thieves out here are thorough. It didn't add up. The ambush, the expensive clothes, the selective robbery. It felt like something more than a crime of opportunity. It felt personal. As Jake sat down to the hot meal Rosalie set before him, a plate of stew and fresh bread, he realized that dragging the stranger out of the desert hadn't been the end of his involvement. It was only the beginning. He had pulled this man back from the edge of the grave, and in doing so, he had stepped into the shadow of whatever trouble had put him there in the first place. And in a town like Redemption, creek shadows had a way of coming alive after dark. The next 2 days were a blur of waiting. The stranger, who they had taken to calling the traveler, drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness. Dr. Finch and Rosalie took turns sitting with him, forcing sips of broth and water between his cracked lips, changing the cold compresses on his forehead. Jake found himself caught in the town's orbit, an unwilling satellite to the dying man. He helped Gus at the forge, earning his keep the rhythmic clang of hammer on steel, a welcome distraction from the tense quiet of the sick room. He learned more about Redemption Creek in those 2 days than he'd learned about any place in years. He learned that Rosalie had inherited the boarding house from her parents, who had died of influenza 5 years prior, and she ran it with a quiet strength that Jake found himself admiring. He learned that Dr. Finch had served as a surgeon in the Union Army and had come west to escape the ghosts of the battlefield, only to find new ones. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Jake was in the sick room, watching as Rosalie gently bathed the traveler's face. Suddenly the man's eyes opened. The delirium was gone. They were clear, lucid, and filled with a weary intelligence. Where am I?" he asked, his voice a dry whisper. "You're in Redemption Creek," Rosalie said softly, a smile touching her lips. "You're safe." The man looked from her to Jake, his gaze lingering on Jake's worn, sun-creased face. I remember you. You gave me water." "I did," Jake confirmed. "You saved my life. The doctor and Miss Miller did that. I just handled the transportation." The man tried to sit up, then winced and fell back against the pillows, his eyes flashing with pain as he remembered his leg. "My name," he said, breathing heavily. "It's Arthur." He offered nothing more. No surname, no destination. Later that afternoon, the stagecoach rattled into town, bringing with it the mail, a few dusty passengers, and a man who immediately set Jake's teeth on edge. He was tall and gaunt, with a face like a blade, and dead, emotionless eyes. He wore a long black duster, despite the heat, and a low-slung holster that seemed molded to his thigh. He didn't swagger into the saloon like a common cowboy. He moved with a predator's economy of motion. Jake was sitting on the porch of the boarding house, cleaning his colt, when the man in the black duster emerged from the saloon. The man's eyes swept the street, missing nothing, and they paused for a fraction of a second too long on the doctor's office next door. He then walked over to the livery stable, spoke briefly to the owner, and then began a slow, deliberate patrol of the town, his gaze lingering on faces, his posture radiating a quiet menace. Jake's instincts, honed by years of reading men, screamed danger. This wasn't a drifter. This was a hunter. He went inside and found Rosalie in the kitchen. There's a new man in town. Black duster. Looks like a wolf sizing up a flock of sheep. Rosalie glanced out the window. I saw him get off the stage. Gives me a chill. He was asking questions at the livery, Jake said, about anyone new coming into town in the last few days, specifically anyone looking beat up or injured. The implication hung in the air between them. Whoever had ambushed Arthur wasn't content to leave him for dead. They were making sure the job was finished. That evening, Jake saw the man whose name he'd learned was Pike talking to Sheriff Brody. Brody was nodding, looking uncomfortable, while Pike did most of the talking, his gestures sharp and dismissive. A few minutes later, Brody crossed the street and knocked on the doctor's door. Jake was already there, having followed his gut. He stood in the corner of the parlor as Dr. Finch let the sheriff in. Evening, Doc, Miss Miller. Brody began twisting his hat in his hands. Jake. Just have to ask a few official questions. This fellow you brought in. Got a name for him yet? He says it's Arthur, Doctor. Finch replied coolly. Arthur, huh? Arthur what? He didn't say, Jake cut in. And he's in no condition to be answering a lot of questions. Brody's eyes darted nervously towards the window, as if he could feel Pike's gaze on him, even from across the street. Look, there's a fella in town, a Pinkerton agent by the name of Pike. Says he's tracking a man who absconded from a work contract back east. An embezzler. Matches the description of your patient here. Fancy clothes, soft hands. Dr. Finch snorted. Pinkerton. That man looks more like a hired gun than a detective. He has a warrant, Doc Brody said, his voice pleading. He wants to see the patient, to identify him. Absolutely not, Rosalie said, stepping forward. That man is in no condition to be moved or questioned by anyone, especially not by a vulture like that. I'm with them, Jake said, his voice low and hard. He took a step forward, and for the first time Sheriff Brody seemed to notice the quiet intensity in Jake's eyes, the way his hand rested near his pistol. This Arthur fellow was ambushed and left for dead. That sounds less like a Pinkerton arrest and more like a failed murder. You let that man Pike in here, Sheriff, it'll be over my dead body. The threat was unmistakable. Brody's face paled. He was a man of bluster, not action. The thought of a gunfight in the doctor's office was more than he could stomach. Now hold on, Jake, no need for that kind of talk. He stammered. I'm just doing my job. Then your job is to tell that hired killer to produce more than a piece of paper if he wants to get through this door. Jake finished. Defeated, Brody turned and left, muttering under his breath. They watched him cross the street and speak to Pike, who stood motionless in the deepening twilight. Pike stared at the doctor's house for a long moment, his face unreadable before turning and walking back toward the saloon. The immediate threat had passed, but the air in the room was thick with a new, colder fear. He won't give up that easy, Dr. Finch said, rubbing his tired eyes. Whoever that boy is, he's in more trouble than a broken leg. Jake walked over to the window and peered through the curtains. The street was quiet, but it felt like a coiled snake. Pike was a professional. He would wait. He would watch. And when the time was right, he would strike. I'll take the first watch, Jake said, pulling a chair into the hall where he could see both the front and back doors of the boarding house and the doctor's office. Rosalie, you and the doc should get some sleep. He didn't know who Arthur was or what he'd done. But Jake had dragged him this far. He'd invested his sweat, his time, and now his safety. A stubborn, possessive sense of responsibility had taken root. He'd be damned if he'd let some two-bit killer in a black duster finish the job now. The whispers had turned into a direct threat, and the shadows gathering in Redemption Creek were no longer formless. They had a name, and that name was Pike. The next morning, Arthur was sitting up in bed, propped against a stack of pillows. The color was returning to his face, and the light in his eyes was stronger. He watched as Jake entered the room, a tray with a bowl of soup in his hands. "You're still here," Arthur said. It wasn't a question. "Seems so," Jake replied, setting the tray on the bedside table. "You have an unwelcome admirer in town, a man named Pike. Calls himself a Pinkerton, says you're an embezzler." Arthur's face tightened. He looked away, his jaw clenched. Pike. Of course. He's no Pinkerton. He's a dog on a leash, whose leash Jake pressed his patience wearing thin. He'd put his own life on the line. He deserved to know what kind of game he'd stumbled into. Arthur hesitated, his gaze shifting around the small room as if searching for an escape. He looked at Jake, truly looked at him, seeing the unyielding set of his jaw, the hard-earned lines around his eyes. He saw a man who wouldn't be put off with half-truths. "My full name, Arthur," said his voice, barely above a whisper, "is Arthur Vance." The name meant nothing to Jake. He shrugged. "All right, Arthur Vance. Who wants you dead?" Arthur took a deep breath. "My father is Alistair Vance." This time the name struck a chord. Governor Alistair Vance, the territorial governor, a pillar of iron who was trying against all odds to bring law and order to the untamed Arizona territory. He was a man known for his rigid honesty and his refusal to be bought by the powerful cattle barons and mining tycoons who wanted to carve up the territory for their own profit. Jake stared at Arthur, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. The expensive clothes, the educated speech, the relentless professional pursuit by Pike. This wasn't about a gambling debt or a spurned lover. This was big. "You're the governor's son," Jake said flatly. Arthur nodded. "I was traveling from Tucson to Prescott to meet him. I was carrying something for him. Something important." "And you were ambushed," Jake finished, "by Pike." "He was one of them. There were two others. They didn't want to just rob me. They were looking for something. They tore my saddlebags apart." Arthur's hand went to his chest. "I think they believed I was already dead when they rode off. My horse bolted during the attack, or I imagine they would have taken him." "What were they looking for?" Jake asked. "What was so important that they'd risk killing the governor's son?" Arthur's gaze fell to his mangled boots, which sat on a chair in the corner of the room. "Proof," he said. "My father has been fighting a man named August Hemlock for months. Hemlock owns the Verde Valley Land and Cattle Company, but his real business is power. He wants to control the water rights for the whole territory. He's been trying to push through a bill that would give him a monopoly, and my father is the only one standing in his way." Jake knew the name Hemlock, a man who cast a long and dark shadow over the territory, whose wealth was matched only by his ruthlessness. "My father's informants gathered evidence," Arthur continued, his voice gaining strength. "A ledger. It details bribes paid to territorial legislators, judges, even a few federal marshals. It proves a conspiracy that goes all the way to the top. The original was too dangerous to transport, so I was carrying a certified copy, along with a signed deposition from Hemlock's former bookkeeper, the man who provided the ledger." He pointed a trembling finger toward his boots. "They searched my bags, but they didn't check the lining of my boot. The left one. My father had a false heel put in it by a master cobbler in Tucson." Jake walked over to the chair and picked up the dusty, blood-stained boot. He ran his fingers along the inside. It felt a normal, But then he felt it, a slight irregularity in the heel. Using his pocket knife, he carefully prized the leather insole away. Beneath it, a thin, hollowed-out compartment had been carved into the thick leather of the heel, and nestled inside was a small oilskin-wrapped packet. He pulled it out and handed it to Arthur. With shaking hands, Arthur unwrapped it. Inside were several pages of tightly folded paper filled with names, dates, and figures, all in a meticulous hand. There was also a single sheet with a sworn statement, signed by a man named Horace Greenley, and notarized with an official seal. This was it. The reason for the ambush, the motive for murder. This small packet of papers could bring down one of the most powerful men in the territory. Hemlock must have found out you were carrying it, Jake surmised. He sent Pike to get it back and eliminate the messenger. And now Pike is here. Arthur said, his face pale. He knows he failed. He knows I survived. He won't leave without this. He looked down at the papers in his hand, then up at Jake, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resolve. My father needs to get these papers. They're the only thing that can stop Hemlock from stealing the future of this territory. The weight of the situation settled on Jake with the force of a physical blow. He was no longer just a cowboy who had saved a stranger. He was now the guardian of the governor's son and the keeper of a secret that could get them all killed. The simple act of giving a dying man a drink of water had led him here to this small room in a dusty town standing between a young man's life and a powerful man's ambition. Well, Jake said, his voice a dry rasp as he slid his Colt from its holster to check the action. The click of the hammer being cocked and released was the only sound in the room. It seems things just got a whole lot more complicated. Redemption Creek was no longer a sanctuary. It was a powder keg, and Pike was holding the match. And somewhere out there, the man who had lit that match, August Hemlock, was waiting. Word of the governor's son recuperating in Redemption Creek spread faster than a prairie fire. It wasn't broadcast, but in a small town, secrets have a short lifespan. Perhaps the livery owner who spoke to Pike put 2 and 2 together. Maybe Sheriff Brody, in a moment of drunken candor at the saloon, let something slip. However it happened, the atmosphere in the town shifted. The arrival of August Hemlock himself was the confirmation. He didn't ride in like a common man. He arrived in a polished black buggy, pulled by 2 magnificent black stallions, a driver in a smart coat at the reins. Hemlock was a man in his 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that seemed out of place against the town's dusty backdrop. He had a neatly trimmed silver beard, a confident posture, and eyes that were as cold and hard as river stones. Pike was with him, riding alongside the buggy, a silent, dark sentinel. They pulled up in front of the saloon. Hemlock stepped down, dusting off his coat, and his gaze swept the street, coming to rest on the boarding house and the doctor's office. It was the look of a man assessing property he intended to acquire. Jake watched from the window of Rosalie's parlor. The devil himself has come to call, he murmured. Later that day, Hemlock made his move. He didn't send Pike. He came himself. He knocked on the door of the boarding house, and when Rosalie answered, he removed his hat with a flourish, a picture of gentlemanly concern. "Ma'am," he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "My name is August Hemlock. I understand that young Arthur Vance is recuperating here. His father and I are dear friends. I was in the area and heard the terrible news of his accident. I've come to offer my assistance." Jake stepped into the doorway, positioning himself slightly in front of Rosalie. He didn't say a word, just stared at Hemlock, his expression unreadable. Hemlock's polite smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened as they met Jake's. "And you must be the man who found him. A hero, I'm told. The territory owes you a debt of gratitude." I'm just a man who was passing through, Jake said, his voice level. A man of commendable modesty, Hemlock purred. Might I have a word with you in private? As a concerned citizen, I feel it's my duty to ensure young Arthur's well-being. He gestured toward the street. Jake gave a slight nod to Rosalie, a silent signal to stay inside and lock the door. He stepped onto the porch, letting the screen door swing shut behind him. He followed Hemlock a few paces down the boardwalk, away from the boarding house, stopping in the shade of the blacksmith's awning. Pike stood across the street, watching his hand, never far from his gun. Let's dispense with the pleasantries, Mr. Sterling Hemlock said, his tone shifting from silken to steel. I know who you are. An ex-ranger, they say. A man of certain skills. I also know who is in that room, and I know what he was carrying. Is that so? Jake said, his posture relaxed, but his senses on high alert. It is, Hemlock affirmed. And I am here to retrieve my property. Those papers are a private business matter stolen from me by a disgruntled employee and twisted for political purposes by the governor. I want them back. They don't belong to you, Jake stated simply. Hemlock chuckled a low, humorless sound. Possession is everything in this territory, Mr. Sterling, a concept I'm sure you understand. You are a man without prospects, a drifter. Your kind values survival. Let me appeal to that instinct. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick leather wallet. He opened it, revealing a sheaf of crisp banknotes. $5,000, he said, his voice a tempting whisper. In gold certificates, more money than you'll see in 10 years of punching cattle. Enough to buy that piece of land you've always dreamed of, to build a ranch, to be your own man. All you have to do is walk away. Get on your horse and ride out of town. Forget you ever saw Arthur Vance. Forget everything. Jake looked at the money, then back at Hemlock's expectant face. The offer was staggering. It was a fortune. It was the easy way out. It was freedom. And what happens to the boy? Jake asked. Hemlock's expression turned cold. Mr. Vance will have a tragic relapse. The infection from his wound, it will prove too much for him. Dr. Finch will be devastated, of course, but such things happen on the frontier. It will all be very neat, very tidy. The casual cruelty of it, the utter disregard for a human life, settled like ice in Jake's stomach. This was the bargain, his future for Arthur's life. And if I say no, Jake asked, his voice quiet. Hemlock's smile was a thin, predatory slash. Then you have made a poor business decision. You see, I will get those papers. The only variable is you. You can be a rich man riding away from this town, or you can be a dead man buried behind it. Pike is very good at his job, and he is not alone. I have 6 men riding in as we speak. They will be here by morning. This town, this boarding house. It's a flimsy wooden box, Mr. Sterling, easily broken. He held the money out. This is your last chance. Your life of solitude and peace, or a shallow grave in Redemption Creek. The choice is yours. Jake looked from the money in Hemlock's hand to the boarding house, where he knew Rosalie was watching, where Arthur lay with a packet of papers that held the fate of the territory. He thought of the man he'd been, a drifter, determined to stay out of other people's fights. But something had changed on that prairie. The weight of that travois had settled not just on his horse, but on his conscience. He met Hemlock's gaze, and for the first time, a slow, cold smile touched his own lips. You should have offered me 4,000, Jake said. Hemlock blinked, confused. What, 5,000 is an insulting amount, Jake continued, his voice laced with a dangerous calm. It makes me think you're desperate. And if you're desperate, it means those papers are even more important than I thought. He turned his back on Hemlock and the money. You can tell your men the offer is declined." He walked back to the boarding house without looking back. He could feel Hemlock's enraged stare burning into his back. The bargain had been offered. The line had been drawn. Morning was coming, and with it a storm of blood and bullets. Jake had made his choice. He wasn't a drifter passing through anymore. He was a man making a stand. The dawn broke grey and tense, the air thick with unspoken dread. Hemlock's men had arrived during the night. There were 8 of them now, including pike-hard-bitten men, with the cold eyes of wolves. They didn't hide their presence. They took up positions across the street, in the saloon on the roof of the livery stable, turning the center of town into a killing ground. Inside the boarding house, the defenders were few. There was Jake checking his Colt and the Winchester rifle he'd taken from his saddle. There was Dr. Finch, who had produced a hefty double-barreled shotgun from beneath his examination table, his hands surprisingly steady. And there was Rosalie. Jake had tried to get her to hide in the cellar, but she refused, her jaw set with a stubborn resolve he was coming to know well. She stood ready with a kettle of boiling water and an old single-shot rifle of her father's, declaring that this was her home, and she'd not be run from it. Arthur, pale but determined, lay in his bed, his borrowed Colt resting on the blanket beside him. Even Sheriff Brody, to Jake's surprise, had found a sliver of a spine. He'd come over at first light, his face grim. "Hemlock tried to buy me," he'd said, shame-faced. "Told me to look the other way. I may be a fat, lazy lawman, Jake, but I ain't a crooked one. I'm with you." He held up his shotgun, a mirror to the doctors. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they were united. The waiting was the worst part. The silence stretched, broken only by the nervous whinny of a horse or the creak of a floorboard. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the dusty street. The first shot came without warning. It wasn't a signal or a shout, just the sharp crack of a rifle from the saloon roof, opposite, splintering the window frame inches from Jake's head. The battle had begun. Jake returned fire instantly, the Winchester bucking against his shoulder. He saw a man on the roof clutch his arm and scramble for cover. Glass shattered as Dr. Finch unleashed both barrels of his shotgun toward the saloon's windows, sending Hemlock's men diving for the floor. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Bullets tore through the thin, clappered walls of the boarding house, ripping wallpaper, shattering a mirror, and sending splinters flying. Rosalie, stationed at a back window, fired her rifle at a man trying to circle around through the alley, the shot going wide but forcing him back. "They're trying to pin us down," Jake yelled over the din. "Brody, you and the doc keep them busy at the front. I'm going out the back." "That's suicide," Brody shouted back. "Staying here is suicide," Jake retorted. He knew their only chance was to break the siege to sow chaos. He moved low and fast to the kitchen, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder. "Rosalie, keep their heads down back here." She gave a curt nod, her face pale, but her eyes blazing, and reloaded her rifle. Jake slipped out the back door, using a woodpile for cover. 2 of Hemlock's men were in the alley preparing to rush the house. He raised the Winchester, took a breath, and fired. The first man spun around and dropped. The second swore and dove behind a water trough, firing wildly in Jake's direction. Lead whizzed past Jake's ear. He ducked back behind the woodpile, worked the lever action of his rifle, and waited. He counted to 3, then popped up and fired again, just as the gunman rose to take another shot. The bullet caught the man in the chest and he collapsed into the dust. 2 down. But more were coming. From the front of the house, the shotgun blasts from Brody and Finch were sporadic. They were conserving ammunition. The return fire was constant. Pike was directing them, his voice a cold bark from across the street. He was a tactician. He was trying to draw their fire to make them waste their precious few cartridges. Suddenly, A new sound joined the cacophony, the roar of fire. Jake peered around the corner of the house. One of Hemlock's men had tossed a burning torch onto the roof of the doctor's office next door. Flames began to lick at the dry wooden shingles. "Fire!" Rosalie screamed from inside. They were being burned out. Panic seized them for a moment, but then Dr. Finch, his face grim, yelled, "Well, we have to fight it." It was a desperate play. Brody laid down covering fire, while the doctor, surprisingly agile for his age, scrambled out the back with 2 buckets. Jake joined him, firing his Winchester to keep the gunman at bay, as the old doctor worked the pump handle, filling the buckets with a frantic energy. Inside, the smoke was starting to thicken. Arthur Coffing had managed to drag himself off the bed and was on the floor, his pistol aimed at the door of his room. Jake knew they couldn't last. Hemlock would win. He would burn them to the ground and pick off the survivors as they fled. They needed a miracle. And then, over the crackle of flames and the thunder of guns, a new sound came from the end of the street. The pounding of hooves. A lot of them. For a heart-stopping moment, Jake thought Hemlock had brought in more reinforcements. But then a voice boomed across the town, a voice accustomed to command. "In the name of the territory of Arizona, lay down your arms." Through the smoke, Jake saw them. A dozen riders armed with repeating rifles fanning out at the end of the street. They weren't cowboys. They wore the badges of territorial marshals, and at their head, on a powerful grey stallion, sat a man with an iron-grey beard and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Governor Alistair Vance. Hemlock's men were caught completely by surprise. Pike, ever the professional, realized the game was up. He fired one last shot toward the marshals and then darted between 2 buildings, vanishing into the back alleys. But the rest of the hired guns, caught between the marshals and the besieged boarding house, lost their nerve. They threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. August Hemlock stood frozen on the saloon porch, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He stared at the governor, his plan, his empire crumbling to dust around him. The siege was over. Jake lowered his rifle, his body trembling with adrenaline. He leaned against the wall of the house, the heat of the fire on his back, and watched as the governor dismounted and strode toward them. The fire was already being doused by the marshals who had formed a bucket brigade. The fight for Redemption Creek was done, and the future of the territory had just been saved in its dusty, blood-soaked street. Governor Alistair Vance stepped through the smoke-filled doorway of the boarding house, his face etched with a father's desperate worry. He found his son Arthur, pale and smoke-stained, being helped into a chair by Rosalie and Dr. Finch. The reunion was not one of loud proclamations, but of quiet, profound relief. The governor knelt by his son, his hand resting on Arthur's shoulder, his eyes conveying a depth of gratitude that needed no words. Then the governor stood and turned his attention to the room at large, to the faces of the people who had stood by his son. His gaze fell upon the haggard sheriff, the soot-stained doctor, the determined woman with the rifle, and finally settled on Jake Sterling. "You are the man who found him." "Governor Vance," said his voice, a deep rumble of authority and emotion. "Mr. Sterling, my son told me everything in the letters he managed to get to me via a friendly stage driver. He told me how you dragged him across the prairie, how you stood against Hemlock's threats." Jake simply nodded, too weary for words. He felt out of place amidst the emotion and the officialdom of the marshals who were now rounding up Hemlock's men. August Hemlock himself was being led away in irons, his face a thunderous mask of impotent rage. "A debt of blood and honor is not easily repaid, Mr. Sterling." The governor continued, stepping closer. "But the territory of Arizona will try. I am prepared to offer you the full $5,000 reward I had posted for the capture of Hemlock and his gang. Furthermore, a man of your character and skill is needed. I can offer you a commission as a captain in the Territorial Rangers. You would answer directly to me. You can name your post. The offer was staggering, a life-altering proposition. A fortune, a title, a purpose. It was everything a man could want. Rosalie looked at him, her eyes wide, a hopeful expression on her face. Sheriff Brody slapped him on the back, a wide grin on his face. Jake looked at the governor, a man of immense power offering him a place at his side. He looked at Arthur, the young heir whose life he had saved. He looked at Rosalie, whose quiet strength had been an anchor in the storm. And then he looked past them all through the shattered window to the endless prairie stretching out under the vast sky. He had run from his past, from the man he used to be seeking, only to be left alone. But here, in this dusty town, in this crucible of violence, he had found something he thought he'd lost forever, a reason to make a stand. He had proven to himself that the core of decency he'd tried to bury was still there. But the life of a ranger of politics and command was not his. The call of the open country of solitude and self-reliance was too deeply ingrained in his soul. Governor Jake said, his voice clear and steady, "I appreciate the offer, more than you know. But I'm not a captain. I'm just a cowboy." He paused. As for the reward, these people, he gestured to Rosalie. Dr. Finch and Brody, they fought just as hard. They deserve it more. This is their town. Let the money rebuild what was broken here today. The doctor's office, the bullet holes in Miss Miller's home. He walked over to his saddlebags, which Rosalie had brought in from the stable. He pulled out his bedroll and his meager supplies. "I will, however, accept enough to buy a new blanket and some supplies. The last ones got torn up, making a travois." Governor Vance stared at him, a look of profound respect dawning in his eyes. He understood. Some men weren't made for fences, even golden ones. "So be it," the governor said, with a solemn nod. "The territory will see that Redemption Creek is rebuilt and its heroes rewarded. And you, Mr. Sterling, will have whatever you need." An hour later, Jake was ready to leave. His mare, Daisy, was saddled and waiting. The town was already beginning to stir with a new energy, the energy of survival and rebirth. Arthur, resting comfortably, shook Jake's hand with a strength that belied his condition. "I owe you my life, Jake. If you ever need anything—" "Just stay out of trouble," Jake said, with a rare, small smile. He turned to Rosalie, who stood on the porch of the boarding house, twisting a cloth in her hands. The air between them was filled with unspoken things. "You're really leaving," she said softly. "It's what I do," he replied. "Where will you go, San Pedro River country?" "Find a little piece of land. Be left alone." "You say that?" She said, her gaze knowing, "But I don't think you're meant to be alone, Jake Sterling. You just proved it." He held her gaze for a long moment, an entire conversation passing between them without a single word. He tipped his hat. "Goodbye, Rosalie." "Goodbye, Jake." He swung up into the saddle. He didn't look back as he rode out of town, heading west toward the setting sun. He rode away from a fortune, from a prestigious commission, from the gratitude of the most powerful man in the territory. He rode away from the governor's heir he had saved. But he wasn't the same man who had ridden into the Badlands days before. He was no longer just drifting. He was riding with purpose, a man who had been weighed and measured in a town called Redemption, and had not been found wanting. The prairie was still vast and unforgiving, but for the first time in a long time, Jake Sterling didn't feel lost in it. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The story of Jake Sterling and the governor's heir became a quiet legend in the Arizona Territory, A tale not of a famous lawman or a notorious outlaw, but of an ordinary man's extraordinary choice. It's a reminder that in the vast, unforgiving landscapes of the Old West, a man's character was his only true currency. Jake Sterling rode into Redemption Creek with nothing but a horse and a past he was trying to outrun, and he rode out with the one thing that truly mattered, his honor reaffirmed not by a badge or by gold, but by a selfless act of courage. These are the stories that built the West tales of grit, sacrifice, and the unexpected crossroads where destiny forces a man to choose who he truly is. If this journey into the heart of the frontier stirred something in you, then make sure to hit that like button. Share this story with anyone who loves a classic Western drama. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales of the legends, the loners, and the unsung heroes of the Wild West. We've got a lot more trail to ride together.